Hello, Final Fantasy XI fans. With Final Fantasy XI's mobile game now cancelled, many players are worried about the series' future. As we all know, Final Fantasy XIV's Shadowbringer era has created a resurgence and a new wave of MMO players. And while the general majority of gaming public believes that Final Fantasy XIV is an updated version of Final Fantasy XI, many people and players are starting to realize that could not be further from the truth. 14 heavily emphasizes the single-player experience and holds the player's hands. And while that's good and all, Final Fantasy XI, historically, is a game that, due to its high difficulty, and possibly being the hardest Final Fantasy in the series, and challenging, requires people to work together in battle, build bonds, and while also a strong emphasis is required on needing a guide to make progress. While both games are Final Fantasy MMO RPGs, they're almost night and day, and many gamers are realizing that and finding out which game caters to their taste in 2021. While Final Fantasy XIV is currently the spotlight at this time of this recording, here are 5 reasons why Square Enix won't just give up on Final Fantasy XI.
Number 1. Final Fantasy XI is a numbered entry in the franchise. Final Fantasy is Square Enix's golden cow and is the GOAT of RPG franchises. To one day have one of their main entries just disappear from existence is just out of the question. As we all know by now, it's clear Square Enix hasn't given up on the franchise with content, updates, and was considering have a company commission out a mobile version of the game. While this was eventually cancelled, it shows that Square Enix isn't finished making moves with the franchise. Another rumored scenario like this, with another company's main golden cow, is Capcom's Resident Evil. Recently, Capcom had another company work on Resident Evil 3's remake, and sources say they were also going to work on Resident Evil 4's remake next. But due to the mixed reviews of Resident Evil 3, Resident Evil 4's remake is said to begin work back in-house at Capcom. While this is all speculation, maybe a similar fate will follow Final Fantasy XI. Coming in at number 2, Final Fantasy XI was the highest grossing Final Fantasy in the franchise. Even beating out Final Fantasy VII, Final Fantasy XI was only recently beat out by Final Fantasy XIV, both making over $1 billion in their current runs. No matter how you slice that, Final Fantasy XI is a success given the numbers, and numbers play a huge factor into the future of the franchise, especially for a $1 billion IP. Number 3. Remakes and Remasters. In the recent years, Square Enix has been on a successful streak of remastering and remaking games like Final Fantasy VII, Final Fantasy VIII, Final Fantasy IX, Final Fantasy X and X-2, Final Fantasy XII, Saga Frontier, Trials of Mana, Secret of Mana, Legend of Mana, Final Fantasy Crystal Chronicles, and the Kingdom Hearts series, along with many others. It seems to be a winning formula that not only makes a lot of money, but helps veteran players get into newer titles and newer players get into classic titles. This bodes well for Final Fantasy XI. Number 4. 20th Anniversary and the possibility of a Realm Reborn. With 2022 being Final Fantasy XI's 20th anniversary, many speculate Square Enix has something in store to celebrate the game's 2-decade milestone. Diablo 2 is around the same age and is currently being resurrected with a 2021 graphical update. Also, as we've seen in the past, when Final Fantasy XIV started off with mixed reviews, instead of giving up on the franchise, Square Enix found ways to elevate the entry in a whole new and different direction with Realm Reborn, and 14 has been on the upswing ever since. Many have discussed the many ways Final Fantasy XI could be reintroduced into the modern era. As we've discussed, the mobile game version has already been considered, but some have proposed a Realm Reborn-like update into the modern era, while others would prefer a single-player / co-op version of the game to solidify it as an always playable numbered entry. The most popular and obvious idea would be to re-release the game on consoles again with the PS5, Xbox Series X, and Switch while they're still green and still don't have many games. Currently, the PC servers of 11 are the only ones left, with the Xbox 360 and PS2 versions shut down. And given some gamers only play on consoles, this could give a resurgence to the game's popularity, especially since Final Fantasy XI isn't the most accessible game given all the hoops one must go through with play online and configuring a controller to the PC. While that's a piece of cake for some, that's not always the case for the average gamer, so bringing on board the console audience back to 11 with a fresh Shadowbringers-like coat of paint, maybe some voice acting, could be the perfect way to keep the franchise running with a new audience. Another option could be an upgraded subscription that allows access to both 11 and 14 to encourage players to actively play both, especially given many people that have played 14 have also originally played 11, and given how much more challenging and different it is from Final Fantasy XIV, many players may find Final Fantasy XI's experience a natural progression from 14, or a nostalgic revisit. Number 5. Domination over the MMO world. While we all know Square Enix doesn't like competing with its own titles, the earliest we could even hear about this is 2022, around the time of the 20th anniversary, especially given Endwalker needs its time in the sun. But that's the beauty of it. Square Enix could alternate between these two titles and have complete domination over the MMORPG business, especially now when their main competition Blizzard is currently wounded by a series of scandals which affects World of Warcraft. Even though Final Fantasy XI is still alive and kicking, it seems very possible for Square Enix to simultaneously maintain two MMORPGs that are at the top of the industry at the same time, especially when these two games are so extremely different and they both balance each other out so well. What Final Fantasy XIV lacks, Final Fantasy XI makes up for it, and vice versa. Just do us all a solid favor, Square Enix, and ditch play online the same way 14 has.
In close, while I love Final Fantasy XIV, I feel the game has made me a much more seasoned and experienced MMORPG player. And when I was younger and played Final Fantasy XI for the first time on the Xbox 360, I didn't have that experience that I have now. With that said, I enjoyed how the bonds and organic cooperation of Final Fantasy XI worked. There's nothing else out there like it. And while this is no shade at all to Final Fantasy XIV, I appreciate much more what Final Fantasy XI was trying to accomplish now. I had a much more fulfilling sense of accomplishment playing it, finding something new, surviving enemy encounters, working to get a job, traveling the world, teaming up with new friends in the wilderness, adventuring in the giant sandbox meant so much more in Final Fantasy XI. And many of us want more of a high-stakes experience like that. Both of these games can coexist together, and I think Square Enix really does know that. Cheers, everyone, if you've made it to the end of this video. Leave a like and comment for the algorithm gods. But seriously, it's helpful and lets me know if this content is worth making. Me, Jinx, signing out.